Monse just mentioned the special issue they were setting up. It is going live in the next days. Plenty of time left. So if you're interested in thinking a little bit about what makes artificial intelligence and machine learning more applicable to everyone in the field, not just researchers but also practitioners, have a chat with me today or tomorrow. I'm going to be here and we can discuss a little bit about the special issue. Today I brought a paper that I participated as a research team with, and the paper is called Non-Standard Errors. So you might have heard about this paper already. It is a massive effort of 343 authors from 34 countries in this world, and I'm going to present a little bit what we did in this project and the results. I mean, the results is what matters for today, because the paper basically starts with giving researchers such as you and practitioners a set of hypotheses, the data set that is exactly the same for everyone, and then every research team has to answer or analyze these hypotheses and accept them, reject them, and report their findings. And what the lead team, I'm getting to this in a second, does is to look at the results and how they vary across these research teams. And we would naturally think, okay, if we have one data set and we have some pretty tightly formulated hypotheses, then every research team should come up with similar results, right? Because that's the setting that we have when we write papers or when we write reports. You start with your data set, you analyze your hypothesis, and you publish your results. And then everyone believes these results because they should be robust, you had a review, and so on and so forth. So what happens here is now that we have over 100 teams doing exactly this, and then these results are compared. And what comes of it is that the results are not the same, right? We have something that is called non-standard errors. So we all know standard errors that come from the population and from the sample, and I will speak about what these non-standard errors are in detail in a few seconds. But what comes from this paper, what's the main takeaway, is that there is another component that's completely overlooked once we start analyzing data sets, once we start analyzing real-life data. I walk a little bit over here, so I'm also talking to you, right? So non-standard errors is the title of the paper. What I'm going to talk about today is based on a slide deck from Albert Mankwelt, who is one of the lead authors of this study. So if you want to look up these slides in a similar version, you can follow this link. I guess this presentation will be made available to you if you want to. And as I mentioned before, over 300 authors, and the lead author team you see here, those are the scientists that did the whole analysis of pooling the results and analyzing the variation of results. Anna Dreba and Albert Mankwelt are the leads here. The paper can be found on SSRN. I bring the link on my last slide, so you can look this up. And yeah, so that's the setup of the whole paper. You know where it's coming from. And now I'm going to introduce a little bit what non-standard errors are, right? So we all know standard errors. And very early on, it was defined or kind of put in words that standard errors can be described as, it is evident that one would, in general, expect to make smaller standard errors in estimating x1 from the two associated variables x2 and x3 than in estimating it from only one, say x2, right? So we think that with larger data sets and with more things to work on, our standard errors should be smaller. Now, the term non-standard errors recoins this description, and we now formulate it as, it is evident that one would in general expect to make smaller standard errors in estimating x1 by engaging two appropriate research teams, x2 and x3, than in estimating it from only one, say x2. So that basically describes that if we would ask multiple people to do the same analysis, we should get robust results. We should get a good idea if those findings are valid. And basically what's described here in this slide is nothing else than replicating a study, right? Assume you submit to a journal, you give them your code, your data, and the reviewer is quite interested in what you've done, sits down, does it again. Right? So you should think that we should get better results if we have multiple teams or multiple scientists, multiple researchers work on the same topic with the same data, with the same hypothesis. So before I'm telling you about the results, why this didn't work too well, or what standard, non-standard errors are, I'm going to define a little bit what we're doing. I will introduce the project to you and some of the hypotheses that we tested. I give you a quick overview of the data, a quite unique data set, and then I'm going into details for the results. And obviously the conclusions that I now already introduced a little bit to you are quite interesting for everyone here in this room, because all of you are doing active research, and all of you do exactly what has been done in here. You have a data set, you have some research questions, you operationalize some hypothesis, and then you say, those are my findings. And since you did a good job in doing your analysis, everything is robust, you say these findings hold, right? But what would happen if someone does the same and the results differ? Who has the correct results? Maybe both of you, right? So that's what I'm going to talk about in the conclusions. And I brought some additional resources, the SSRN links, and some more information on the research plan. So coming to our first section, what are non-standard errors and how can we define them? Non-standard errors are defined as the standard deviation across researchers for the results they report when independently testing the same research question, the same hypothesis on an identical data set, on an identical sample. So that might sound new to you, because usually we don't look into non-standard errors. The only thing we do is we care about our standard errors from estimations. They have to be robust, and we're happy if our results are significant, and so on and so forth. Now, we add an additional layer, non-standard errors, which describes what happens if researchers or multiple entities start analyzing the same hypothesis. So this standard deviation across these results is described as non-standard error. And like I said already before, this adds an additional layer of uncertainty. Right? It's not just standard errors, it's also these non-standard errors. So what happens if we actually have some deviation between results, and we have two teams or two researchers, and both think that they have done a good job in their analysis, that they used robust methodologies? So who's right? Right? That's our additional layer of uncertainty. And we all know how we get from our population to our sample and how this generates our standard errors, right? How this is the source of our standard error during the data generating process. So during this DGP, we find that this is, the source of our standard error, but then what's completely overlooked, but what's the nature of every paper, of every analysis, of every report you're writing, is how you generate the evidence. Right? The way you choose, the models you pick, the computer you run it on, that's all your choice. Right? And that all affects what evidence you come up with. And this is the source of our non-standard error. This is what the paper calls the evidence generating process, the EGP. So that's this new concept, if we want to put it in some methodology setup. So once we get to the sample and we work on the sample that we collected, this is how we end up with a non-standard error once we start analyzing or once we start getting to the evidence. Why is it important? Why should we care about this? Well, we all know what's going on in academia. We all know that it is basically developing towards publish or perish. Everyone needs to publish good papers. Everyone wants to publish them as high as possible, as good as possible. And obviously this introduces some bias, because you want to report proper results. You don't want to report non-results. So what's going on is sometimes you have selective reporting, so-called p-hacking. You only report significant results. You start wiggling around with the data set. I'm not saying this in general. It's being wiggled around with the data set. This data set is shortened, it's augmented. We change the model. just so we get some significant results. Is this a good way? You be the judge, right? Selective publishing is the same problem here. I have to be very careful here what I'm saying because everything is recorded, but you're thinking very well where and what you publish. You have your plan, what you want to do. You have a plan where you want to put it, right? You have to maximize your utility that you get from publishing, okay? So you start thinking about what you're doing with the data. You're not as unconstrained as one would think, and that's a problem because that introduces possible bias. In an ideal world, we might not have these things, yet we have to consider that non-standard errors are still present, okay? And they stem from our evidence-generating process. And in all areas of it, right? What do? You as a researcher, you pick your model, right? You motivate your choice from existing literature. Maybe you come up with a new model. That's the first source of this non-standard error. What happens if someone else wants to ask the same research question, wants to answer the same research question, but uses a different model, right? That's the first level. The second level is the method, how you actually build up this model, how you fill it, how you populate it, right? Your proxy constructions, your data cleaning, very important, outlier detection, how do you deal with outliers, how do you restrict your sample, how do you set up your subsample analysis, your out-of-sample analysis, things like this. This is all your choice. And again, this plays into our evidence-generating process because this choice is yours and might differ from someone else working in the same problem. And obviously the execution, software choice, how you document it, how you prepare your code, right? Software choice is a big issue. It makes a difference sometimes for the optimizers if you work in MATLAB or in R or in Python, right? The difference might be marginal, but sometimes this difference matters, right? Numerical marginal, I mean, right? But the software choice is yours again. It's your choice how you document it. We have this great development in academia now in publishing that journals are asking for the code and journals are asking for the data, at least for the reviewers, so they can run everything and see if you really got to your results as you documented it in your paper. And that's a very important step because that is what we need to make your research replicable. People need to be able to get to the same results. And this is also part of what this project was about. So research question that this paper started with. You heard me talking about research questions now. I mean, if you want, you can repeat this whole study with a different sample and see if it's still the same. But the research questions that were laid out before we started this paper is, how large are non-standard errors in financial economics? Are they sizable? Are they small? Are they relevant? Right? Can they be explained? And that's a very important question. Can they be explained in the cross-section of these researchers that are participating? So does it make a difference if the researcher is a senior professor somewhere at a very highly reputable university, or does it make a difference if the researcher is a postdoc? Not judging on the quality, but it's more about seniority, experience, so on and so forth. Does peer feedback reduce non-standard errors? Extremely important question if you think about your publishing process, right? You send something in, you get a review, and you hope that this review is good. You hope that you get some impulses from this review. You hope that you don't get rejected, right? So the reviewer ideally looks over your paper, thinks about it, repeats a little bit what you've done, at least on a methodology level, and then says, okay, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And so on. So once you get peer feedback, what happens to these non-standard errors if you look at the whole set of research teams working on the same problem? Right? And last question, are researchers accurately aware of the size of these non-standard errors? That's also important. Some of you might have heard about non-standard errors before, but when I started this project as a research team in 2021, I've never heard about it. Obviously, you talk with colleagues about your results and you see that there is some difference sometimes, even if you do the same things. But it has never been addressed in, in a systemic way, and this is what this last question is trying to answer. Are we aware that these things exist? And are we aware of their magnitude? Okay. So literature on these types of studies exist, but not so much in finance. So we do have this analytical variation problem, well known from Lemur from '83, who described fumes which leak from our computing centers. Right? He called for studying the fragility in a much more systemic way, outlining that if you repeat this analysis, why do we end up, or if we do analysis by someone else in a very similar way, why do results differ? Okay. These multi-analyst studies, as we call them, where you have a large set of authors working on the same problem, do exist for neuroscience. So it's very common to do these analysis in neuroscience, in economics even, and in sociology. Not so much in finance so far. Okay, and that is what the paper tries to fill here with this working paper, with this study. As you see, I've been aiming a lot on the term replication here as well, because if I can't replicate your findings, if I can't replicate your results, are they still valid? Who's in the wrong here? Me as someone who tries to replicate it, maybe I overlooked something, or you because maybe you're hiding something, right? That's just this whole thinking process. So who's wrong if you can't replicate something? And ideally, you should be capable of replicating these findings if you have the code, if you have runnable code that you just click play and it feeds the data that was fed into the paper and so on. So these replication studies are common. Now they're becoming much more common if you look at the years when these papers are being published, when these collaborations in open science are being published. So you see a lot of 2016, 17, 2021. And also to reproduce the findings, there's lots of literature already, not so much again on finance. And this is where the gap of this whole project lays. Let's talk about the project. What is the structure? How did this project start? So there are two large sets of researchers participating in this project. The first element are the research teams. Right? We're going to call them RTs. So if you see RTs in the following slides, it's the research teams. Usually made up of two researchers that worked on those hypotheses that were laid out by the lead team. Okay? So we get a set of hypotheses, we get a sample, and those research teams had to write a short paper, 5 pages. So not really a paper, more like a report on your results. How did you get to them? How did you end up with your results? What do your results mean? And what do you do with the hypothesis? Do you reject? Do you accept? Where is your code? And so on, right? So this is part one. This is the research team. Then we had the so-called peer evaluators. It's a non-overlapping set of researchers, so they're not participating in the research part or as research team. The peer evaluators then look at your paper, have a look at your code, and then they judge it. You get a little review. So for each analysis of your hypothesis, 1 to 6, I will show them to you. Those peer evaluators gave you comments. They said, hey, this wasn't good, or this was done very well, or have you considered this, have you considered that? Right? So you get like a review. And then you're asked to repeat your analysis, take into consideration this review of the two peer reviewers, and then redo your analysis. So this are our research teams and the peer evaluators that participated in the first stage of this project. Regarding the sample, I go into much more detail later. So we got the data from Deutsche Börse, 720 million trade records for Eurostoxx 50 index futures over 17 years. So from 2002 to 2018, we got data on every trade that was ever recorded. So quite a large data set that we got in monthly batches, and the details I will introduce later. So this data set is the same for everyone, right? For all these research teams, and the peer evaluators also have these data sets. So peer evaluators, if they wanted to, could have run your code and see how your results basically came up with. It was checked in a different way if your results are replicable. I'll talk about this in a second. So this is the project structure, this is the sample. This is where we started with this. Now, we got 6 hypotheses. I'm going to call them RTH. So those are the research team hypotheses. Those are not the hypotheses of the whole paper yet. Those are the hypotheses that we were asked as a research team, right? So about market efficiency, realized bid-ask spread in this data or in this trading setup, share of client volume to total volume, realized spread in client orders, and so on. So see if you have a look at it. Again, I go into detail in a second. Some of these hypotheses appear to be rather simple, and some of them seem to be a bit more complicated in a way that, you don't know where to start. You don't know how to calculate it, right? Those are the hypotheses. They don't tell you how to do it. So the model choice is yours. Obviously, when we talk about share of client volume to total volume, it's a share. Everyone should be capable of calculating a percentage of something, right? But when we talk about gross trading revenue or realized bid-ask spread based on the data set we have, we didn't have bid-ask recordings. There's some ambiguity in what you can do. If we talk about market efficiency, you can pick from a large set of tests that are out there to test for market efficiency. And again, the choice was with the research teams. So you see, we're already there when you remember this bubbling structure where I showed you where are these non-standard errors coming from. We're already in the model part, right? And the methodology was all on us. We could choose what we wanted to do here. And then this whole thing is set up over 4 stages. First stage is we do our analysis and write this short paper. This I already said. Then we receive feedback from the peer evaluators, 2 of them, and we redo our analysis according to the feedback. That was stage 2. Then there was a 3rd stage where every research team was sent the 5 highest rated papers of this whole set of research teams. So these peer evaluators scored your paper from 0 to 10. Was it a good paper, very good paper, you get a 10, bad paper, you get a 0. So you get the idea. So everyone in this set was sent the 5 highest rated papers, right? By then I was like, very interesting work, very similar to what we got. Some things were different, so we were thinking as our research team, should we redo a few things? And we did. We changed our analysis for 1 hypothesis there. So this is stage 3. And then in stage 4, all constraints were taken away, and we could send new results if we wanted to. So constraints removed means we don't have to provide code anymore, so we don't have to justify how we got to the results, and we could simply copy if we wanted to. The results of those best papers. This was free. We saw what others did now in stage 3, and in stage 4, we could report whatever we wanted. Do we stick to our analysis? Probably most teams did this. I'm not 100% certain about this. Or do we just, redo our analysis based on what the peer evaluators thought would be the best approach? Okay? So 4 stages. Now, speaking a little bit about the methodology, what are we doing? So you see how the sample was generated. For every hypothesis, we had to submit our size effect and a standard error of it. So this RT reported size effect is our YIJT. Okay, I indexes the research team. J indexes the hypothesis, 1 to 6. And T indexes the stages, 1 to 4. Okay, so in 4 stages, we had to report our size effects. And obviously, this error you had is calculated as the difference between this reported size effect per hypothesis per stage minus the overall average per hypothesis. Then we follow Harvey, set up a rather simple ordinary least squares where we use the natural logarithm of the squared error, decompose it, come up with a consistent estimator alpha hat, and from this, we predict the variance for our errors for those research teams as sigma hat squared as exponential of our z times the estimate from our linear regression alpha hat. And then we look into these sigma squares. Okay? If you have questions about the methodology, we can discuss a bit more later. Now I want to move on to the working hypothesis. So having estimated this model, having estimated these errors that the research teams did, the lead team now of this paper that I introduced earlier set out working hypothesis, and this was analyzed by the project leads. We didn't have any, as research team, the research teams didn't have any doing in this anymore. We submitted our results, and the analysis was done by the lead authors here. So they analyzed their hypothesis, and the hypothesis H1 to H3, now you see there's no RT anymore, this is now the working hypothesis. They now analyze if the reported standard errors and the deviation of these standard errors and those results from stage 1 can be explained somehow, right? Can they be explained by team quality? You know, how high is the quality of this research team? And this was measured by our self-reporting of publication record, how many top 5, top 3 publications we have. What's our expertise with large data sets, microstructure analysis, liquidity analysis, so on and so forth. And seniority, are you associate prof, are you full professor already? So this was what was determining, first principal component of all of this, the quality of the research team. Second was workflow quality. Can your results be reproduced? So we had to submit the code. Everyone knew what the data set was, and it was tested if your code, via Cascade, it was tested if your code produces the results that you reported. And you got a score from 0 to 100. 100 is everything can be reproduced. 0, unlikely that your results stem from your code. Okay? Second element. Third element, paper quality. Is the PE score, the evaluator, the peer evaluator score, somehow explaining this size of this type of error? So we would assume that, you know, higher scored papers, very well written papers, very well evaluated papers, in their cluster should produce lower deviations. Right? So that was the whole thinking process behind this. That's H3. Then H4 to 6, essential for our talk here today. Does this error variance change over the different stages? So stage 1 to 2, stage 2 to 3, stage 3 to 4, right? I showed you what happened between these stages. And overall in H7, how do the error variances that were reported vary from stage 1 to 4? So what happens if we compare the reported results in stage 1 and stage 4? Do they differ? Did the non-standard errors reduce, increase? Right? After receiving feedback, after seeing what should be a good paper, and after having the chance of not, you know, restraining yourself by having to report how you got to your results. Okay? And the last hypothesis was H8, accuracy of RT beliefs. So how accurately do the research teams estimate these errors across research teams? And this last hypothesis, very interesting, went really bad in terms that every research team significantly underestimated this deviation across results. Because we were asked, hey, what do you think, knowing that we have over 160 research teams, what do you think is the standard deviation across these results? And we had to put in numbers. I was sitting there being like, well, I don't know, you know. Considering what happened, considering what my own struggles with the hypothesis, you know, where you start, hey, what model do I use? Obviously, there would be some difference. But the results show that this difference was so large that basically none of these teams got even close to, you know, reporting this deviation correctly, right? I'll show you what this means in a second. Quality of participants. I want to show you a little bit how these research teams, or what these research teams are. So you see there's a big difference between research teams and peer evaluators when it comes about fraction with top econ and finance publications. So this was pretty much defined by the lead authors. What is a top 3 finance? What is a top 5 econ? So you had to say, do you have one or don't you have one? So 30% of research teams had this, 85% of peer evaluators had this. So you see there's a difference in publication record here. Associate full professor, relevant experience, big data experience. That means with a sample that's larger than 720 million data points. I don't know if any one of you worked on larger data sets. For me, this was the max, but obviously 65% of research teams worked with larger data sets. Right? I had worked with 100 million before, so 720 was quite big for me. Fractions of consisting more than one team members, right? You see 80% of teams were 2 people, 21% were 1 person. 164 research teams, 34 peer evaluators. So this is what this group structure is. Now I go briefly a little bit into the hypothesis and data. So again, I spoke about this already. We received the same set of hypotheses, same data set. The only thing that was basically set for everyone was the following: estimate the average per year change in percentage terms based on the full sample, test it against the null of no change, report this estimate along its standard error in 4 decimals. So this is how we reported our results. We had to come up with a test. We had to say how this, how our estimates, how these estimates changed over a year, and we had to, give the average per year change in percentage points. And that was already a bit tricky because that affects what model you pick. If we think about market efficiency, there are simple things that you can do, variance ratio tests, but these usually give you, a yes or a no, accept the null or reject the null. So how do you report per year changes in percentage terms? Right? So you had to work on the test statistic. You had to think about how do you generate a test statistic per month, per year, and so on and so forth. Right? Okay, and what I mentioned before already, all our hypotheses reflect some degree of differing vagueness. Some of them are quite clear, and some of them give you lots of room to come up with something that you think is a good choice in terms of model and methodology. Right? So let's talk about the hypothesis. I will speak about the first 3 in detail. The remaining six are similar. So hypothesis 1 basically was assuming that informationally efficient prices follow a random walk, did market efficiency change over time? And this hypothesis that was given was market efficiency has not changed over time. So you now had to come up, this is all you got. You now had to come up with some model, with some methodology to answer this hypothesis, right? Has efficiency changed? Okay, might have. But now how do you report those year-to-year changes in percentage and so on? Okay. Second hypothesis. Did the realized bid-ask spread paid on market orders change over time? Realized spread could be thought of as the gross profit component of the spread as earned by the limit order submitter. So you see lots of information here with this hypothesis. You get lots of information. Basically, they push you on what you have to do because we only have trade records. We don't have the order book. We don't have bid-ask, mid-ask, and so on, mid-prices, nothing, just the trades. So it's going to be very tricky to generate a bid-ask spread. I mean, there's literature on this, obviously. I brought some details here, so if we want to chat about this later, I can show you how our research team approached this. Third one, now you see, was for me the easiest one. I was very happy about this because I worked like 20 minutes on this. Did the share of client volume in total volume change over time? So you see, we have to calculate a share. It's very easy. Did this share change over time, and how did it change over time? So that's easy to calculate, right? So you see, that's an easy hypothesis. Everyone should know how to do this. Well, or whereas for the first 2, there's a lot of variation of what you can do and how you report your findings. The next three we can chat if you want to, if time allows. So data, again, 700 million trade records, only the trades, no order book. What was included per trade was if it was a buy or sell side recorded trade, number of contracts per transaction, and obviously the price this trade was executed at. Then what was also included, which was important for some of the hypotheses, was this a market order or a limit order. So we had an aggressor flag. Okay? Was this thrown into the market or was it a limit order? Then on what account was traded? Was it an agency or market maker or non-market maker? And was the trade executed in full or partial? So that was included, and based on, everyone had this. And it looked like this. So you see for 120 milliseconds on 3rd of December 2018, this is how this sample looked. This is how our data looked. We have a very good time, a very detailed timestamp up to milliseconds. We have the expiry of the contract, so we know what contract was traded. Sell and buy side indicator, trade size and number of contracts, match price, aggressor flag, account role, and execution type, full or partial. And this is what we had, 720 million samples of this. And then you start analyzing it. Last 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about the results, because now is what matters the most. Dispersion of RT results across RT hypothesis. So I told you 6 hypotheses. Hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you see it's a log scale in percentage. 0, 1, 10, 100,000, 10,000, 100,000% of this reported size effect that we generated. And you can see that results vary extremely. 164 results are reported here in those gray little dots. And you can see that results range from minus 100%, how has market efficiency changed over time, minus 100% to plus 100,000%. So same research question, same data set, same way of recording and presenting your findings. And this is what came out of it. Extremely large variation of results. Now think about it. All of these little dots could be a single paper. All of this could be published research. And now you're sitting there being, oh, you know, some say market efficiency has increased or changed positively, and some say it has changed negatively. So what's the result you want to work with? That's up to you, right? You see that this deviation is even larger for the spread question. So how do you calculate the spread? How do you measure it? And so on. So here the dispersion of results is larger. Now my favorite hypothesis, client volume and client share, as you can see, almost no spread. Right? Everything is this is the box plot here, this little green line. Everything is concentrated around minus 8%, minus 9%, minus 7%. So you see a very clearly defined hypothesis, very simple, and results seem to be the same. This is repeated for a second hypothesis when it was about which was about the share of client orders. Similar approach to this, and you see errors are small as well. Large errors for client GDR. That was a tricky one because you had to calculate this GDR first. There are some ways to do this. And client spread also quite a large dispersion. So again, we see that there is deviation. And now what explains this deviation? What drives this dispersion? And I'm going to talk about the findings now that log squared errors seem to be unrelated to the quality of those research teams. So it seems like everyone, independent of the quality of this research team, contributes to this variation of this, or contributes to this dispersion. We find that most estimates are negative, however. So they're insignificant, but they are negative. So you would think that, you know, quality is, or higher quality is decreasing this dispersion, okay? But again, this is not significant. Only if we Winsorize this sample, we reject the null of no effect. So there we find some little effect of quality. So we Winsorize quite a bit, 5% of the sample, and then we find a little bit that quality is actually affecting this non-standard error. Right? What the authors then did, they picked the 9 papers that had the best scores. Those are papers that are these research teams that scored the highest across all matrices. And then they looked into this. And even for them, they found that these errors or this dispersion is quite significant. And even more important, that their results, their findings are inconclusive. So even if you look into the best papers, highly scored, highest replicability score, everything looks perfect, the results differed across hypotheses. For some hypotheses, they were accepted, some hypotheses were rejected. So now you have these super papers, these top papers, research reports, right? And they're inconclusive. So we see we have very good people, very good papers on the same question, on the same hypothesis, and they still come up with different results, and they still vary across these hypotheses. So this is what the table looked like. You see the only statistical significance here with stars at 5% and at 0.5% is for our Winsorized sample. Other than that, team quality, this reproducibility score, average rating of the paper, and hypothesis dummies, they appear to have no significance on what drives this non-standard error, what drives this dispersion across research teams. So we see that we end up with a large error across research teams, and evidence suggests that team quality and quality of your research has very little to do with it. Now the next question is, how does this dispersion change over research stages? What happens to this dispersion if we provide feedback, if we show you the best papers, and if we say, okay, now you can do whatever you want? Right? Now we take the constraints off, now you can report whatever you think is the correct result. It changes quite significantly. Right? So let's talk about convergence across stages. Now you see that we put these stages next to each other for each hypothesis, right? Stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you can see that the dispersion now reduces. You can see that for every hypothesis, except number 3 here, for every hypothesis, this dispersion of results gets smaller. So after receiving peer feedback, people reconsider their analysis. This leads to a convergence of results. After seeing the best papers, we see that people and research teams reconsidered their findings, recalculated them, used a different methodology even, and we see that our results are converging again. And then in the unconstrained set, where you can report whatever you think is best without any provision or providing the code or whatever, we see it further reduces for all, except H3 here, for all hypotheses. So convergence, dispersion declines with feedback. Important observation, these extreme values that were reported, right, that you saw the dots, I go back, you see some very extreme values here, right? Outliers. These outliers surprisingly don't change. So what happens with these research teams? Did they actually consider their feedback? Did they take into consideration the comments? We don't know. Obviously not. They kept on reporting similar findings. Overall, the dispersion is reduced by 53%. So this dispersion can be halved with different types of feedback that is being provided to these research teams. Surprisingly, for me at least, this decline is evenly distributed. So it shows that from stage 1 to 2, we have 14.15, 20, and after this 19% of reduction in this dispersion. That means every type of feedback that these research teams got actually mattered. I remember that our team, we worked very hard from stage 1 to 2, and then only made minor changes from stage 2 to 3, and we kept our results for stage 4. So we didn't change after having constraints taken off because we still worked with the same code, right? Same results. All declines are statistically significant, so that's important. We have a statistically significant change in this non-standard error across all stages. And that's important for you as a scientist, right? Because this shows once you receive feedback on your work in form of giving a presentation at a conference, receiving feedback in a revision, or even in a rejection. Sometimes you get very useful rejection letters with good comments, right? If you get this feedback, it shows that this actually matters, that you properly end up with better findings, or findings, at least if you compare it across a large sample with the same research question, it looks like that these findings converge to hopefully the true value, right? All null hypotheses of no changes between these stages are rejected. Now this is our overview of these convergence findings. I'm not going to go into detail here. That's something you can look up in the table. Now last and also important thing, I have 3 minutes left, I would say. What do these research teams think or believe about this dispersion? And that was very surprising to me because I started with having issues quantifying this dispersion. I was sitting there talking to my other co-author, being like, hey, how do we estimate this? Is there any way of believing in what would be a good measure for this dispersion, right? So this happened in stage 1. We were questioned and incentivized even about the size of this dispersion. Then the lead team ran a test of equality of means, mean between this mean belief, what we reported, what we thought would be the mean of this dispersion, versus the actual standard deviation of this report, of this reported size. And this is what matters. Research teams significantly underestimated the size of these non-standard errors. Significantly. That means, as an example for our first hypothesis, and you saw what the dispersion did, you saw how it declined. For this first hypothesis, the underestimation is 99.5%. Right? The null of accurate average belief is rejected for all hypotheses, holds for trimmed and Winsorized samples as well. So none, or at least a very, very small percentage of research teams got even close to reporting or to having a true belief of this dispersion. Now this is how it looks. Those are our reported beliefs on dispersion across research teams. Then you see a red dot and you see a yellow dot. Red is this true standard deviation. Yellow is the standard deviation for the Winsorized and trimmed sample, or for the trimmed sample here. And you see that this is the reported value, the true standard deviation of this, or the true non-standard errors up here. So no one got close. If we start trimming 5% of the sample, then we do get an okay-ish feeling, I would say. We're getting close to our box here. So you see, once we take out extreme values, maybe beliefs are not that bad after all. What you see again is that this belief varies across hypotheses again. So for this generally easy hypothesis 3 that didn't take too much effort to calculate, you see that this belief gets close, right? The trimmed one and the non-trimmed one is getting close, is still underestimated. We're still above our IQR here, right? But we're close. Same for this Klein order one. But here, for the Klein spread, huge mismatch of what you would expect this error to be and what the error actually was. Same for the true error, same for the error that was trimmed. So you see that all research teams were not capable of quantifying this error. So if I had asked you before I got to the results, what do you think those errors were in believing what these errors could be, we would have probably ended up with similar results. So I'm showing you that we are not yet there to understand that if we do repeated research on the same sample for the same hypothesis, we probably end up with different results, and we are not aware of this. We're not aware how different results could be. Okay, conclusions, that's my last slide. Right, wrap up of everything that matters for us today. Non-standard errors add uncertainty to our results, to your reporting, to your research, to everyone's research. They're the same order of magnitude than standard errors, so we cannot forgo them. We have to think about them. Right? This is something that is significant. We have to consider it. We have to consider it in any setting. You as a reviewer, you as a scientist submitting something, right? You thinking about, hey, this study, I get to different results. What's going on? Who's wrong? Should I reach out? Right? So we're calling for more transparency here. Right? You need to have the code, you need to have the data, and then you can be sure that you should be getting to the same results as reported. If not, might be because someone is using a different methodology, different machine. But these errors are there. Right? They co-vary very weakly with team workflow and paper quality. So for everyone, they exist. It's not just for junior scientists. They exist also for professors, for top professors in the US, for everyone that participated in the sample at least. And those were some very high-ranking researchers from the US. They decline significantly after peer feedback, and that's why you see speaking with your fellow peers is essential. As soon as you get peer feedback, it appears that the size of the standard error is decreasing. So, importance of conferences, quality of reviews, quality of feedback in general seems to affect non-standard errors. And lastly, what I just spoke about, everyone that participated in the study underestimated this non-standard error. Okay, so key takeaways on this slide. Some additional resources, if you want to look up the paper, you simply look at SSRN for the non-standard errors, and there's a pre-analysis plan for this project. So the lead authors offered a pre-analysis plan on this project before the project started, outlining everything that would be done. This can also be accessed. All right, thank you very much. This is from my side. I hope it was interesting to you. I hope this gives you some perspective of what we're doing with our lives here in academia and what we should be doing in terms of considering peer feedback. Are there any questions?
Presentation. It's not a question, but I was basically present at the presentation of the certain research studies speaking about the convergence of the European Union members. I mean the convergence of the economies in the European Union members. So exactly what you presented, depending on the approach, models they use. So the hypothesis was the same, right? And they arrived with a different results. Depending, they pick up in fact the same data, right? Hypothesis was the same, but the models approaches they take, delivered that the study went up with a very, very much different result. Okay, so probably this approach can be, you presented, can be applied in the, so to basically to reconcile these results. And you presented, but the question you presented based on this very big sample, milliseconds, right? It's not easy. Sample. Do you have another example, another area where you check that approach?
Excuse me, Tony.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question because
Okay.
otherwise people outside cannot hear.
Okay. So the first comment, let me summarize. The first comment was about the convergence of the European Union reporting.
I mean, a potential of the economy.
The economies, how this varied across applied models and how they converge. Yeah, and how this could be improved by, feedback and different feedback. That was your first comment, because I'm mic'd up, that's why I'm repeating. And your question was then, since we worked on milliseconds, is there another approach to this, or am I aware of another project in finance? No. So I'm not, if this is your question, I'm not aware of another project similar to this in finance that used, a smaller data set. Obviously, microstructure noise in the millisecond or with every trade record is different to deal with, and obviously that might be an issue why these teams chose different approaches to calculating effective bid-ask spread. You can change your variance ratio test for hypothesis 1 across different overlapping windows there. What do you use, an hour, 5 minutes, 30 minutes? So we've done a lot of these tests of, are our results robust if we report on a decline or increase of efficiency, right? What happens if we change the timeline? But that, in the end, was up to every group again. So if you reduce the frequency of the data to, let's say, minute or 5 minute, I'm not sure if this would have had an effect on the results. And I'm not aware of any other project that approached this with a smaller, less frequent data set. No, I'm not. There's another question, yeah?
Yes, these 164 research teams,
yeah.
How were they motivated to work? Usually, if I do some work, I expect to get a publication.
Yeah.
And what did they get something in return?
Okay, I repeat the question for the audience. So the question is why, or what's the incentive for research teams to participate in this? I can only talk about my experience here. I found it very interesting. When this was published in the end of 2020, it was, hey, we're doing this project, or even earlier in 2020, hey, we're doing this project, large data set, large amount of research teams. By then, they didn't know how many, and you had to apply, so you had to report how many publications, age, I think number of citations. I'm not so sure if this was in it, but your position, your experience with high-frequency data. Obviously, you had to bring some in analyzing this amount of data. Obviously, you needed programming skills because most of this was probably run in Python or anything related to being capable of handling such large amounts of data. So back to my own motivation, it was clear from the beginning that the lead authors, who were very experienced, scientists, if you look at their track record, were trying to put this in a proper journal, like in a good journal. So we knew that by participating in this research project, you might get a chance to be part of this analysis of these quite important results that I presented you today. And that for me was motivation enough to go through it and to participate. But there was no monetary element involved, at least not for the initial part, for this belief elicitation. There was some incentive, but we didn't get it. It was basically, do you want to do this? It's going to be a very interesting project. Findings, if we look at other economics, neuroscience experiments, look like there is something non-standard error-wise. Let's do it for finance. Do you want to be part of it? And then you had to apply. So I'm not sure how many people applied and how many got into the project, but in the end it was 164 research teams that made it to the last stage. So 164 was a balanced sample. All 164 groups reported over all 4 stages. But motivation probably similar across everyone to do something very interesting with their time, at least for me. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I pick up from your speech about what was after this final analysis. What was the reactions of these teams who were big outliers?
We don't know. It was all anonymous. So we don't know. So we were given a four-letter code as a team. We don't know because I know a few other teams that participated, but it was mentioned that we shouldn't reach out during these stages with each other. We shouldn't communicate across teams. We should really stay focused on our report. And we should stay focused on our report and don't communicate across teams. And we don't know these teams that reported such high outliers. I don't think it matters who these teams are. What was interesting is that some of them, they kept to their results even after receiving feedback and after seeing, the best papers. So usually, from what I remember, stage 3, when we saw the 5 best papers, the results were close to each other. So let's say they reported a change of 2%, and you're still standing there at your 100,000% or 1,000%, and you see 5 papers all around 1.5, 2, 3, maybe -1. You must ignore this proactively, or you still think that whatever you did is still robust and correct, which can be true. It depends on what you picked. So we don't know who these teams are, but some of them, they kept their estimates, and there must be a reason for this. But I'm only one of the research teams or member of the research teams. I don't know why this was it. Maybe the lead author spoke with them, hey, what happened here? Show me your paper, let's look at it, what you did. Could be that they're correct still, right? I mean, depending on their model, depending on their methodology, depending on this whole evidence-generating process, how they report, it could still be. But we see the convergence to some common value, and some of these extreme values didn't move. So I don't know what happened there. I can only.
Any other
Yeah.
questions from the audience? I really congratulate you, Tony. Really, this was a great talk.
Thank you.
I think the topic is really interesting in many areas. You did this application in financial economics, but given the increase of methods in artificial intelligence, where it seems like lots of decisions have to be taken, that could be something that can be very important in the future. I was going to ask you if you can tell us a couple of things. Maybe I missed that. How long has this taken? I mean, how long?
I don't remember fully, but I think for the first stage you had, I think 3-4 months. The correct dates are in the paper. I would have to look it up now. But you had, I mean, not so much time. It's not that you had years for this, but once you got the data, we had to download the data from a specific date, and then we had a deadline for each stage. And it was made pretty clear that if you don't make it until the deadline, you're out. There was so they didn't waste any time with anyone. So you had to submit, and something the paper mentions, maybe interesting to everyone, is that most of the teams submitted before the deadline. So showing that they really wanted to participate in it and really wanted to make sure that they submit the results and they're willing to do so. So overall, I think the last stage concluded in, I have to lie now, I think it was in early summer or late summer, I'm not so sure, but within a year all these stages were done, and then the whole research, the lead team started analyzing everything, and that went quicker than I expected, because it was a large amount of data, but they've done a terrific job. We were sent the paper before, could comment on it, and then it went live on some TV coverage and some lots of downloads and SSR, and so obviously it's an important analysis. So.
Yeah. And then I would also ask, this is my last question if there is no one else, and what do you think is the source of this error? I mean, from my own experience, I would say that data cleaning, because we have a lot of errors when we get data from insurance companies, we see some errors, and data cleaning is an important step, and then maybe modeling is not so much. What would you think is the main source? Or
so the main source, I can only comment on maybe a few sources, not real main source. What we have seen, what I found very interesting of all of this, is how the dispersion differed across hypotheses. So for a rather simple hypothesis, the dispersion was very small compared to where you had more freedom. So I would assume that, if you don't tell anyone what model to use, what methodology to use, then obviously there will be differences. And that was a discussion I had before, after a talk like this, where the discussant said, obviously you end up with different results if you allow people to use different models. yes, that's a comment you have to consider. So I guess it boils down to model choice, to how you run the model, data cleaning. In parts only for this, because here we got a very clean data set. There was all executed trades. There was nothing dead inside, I would say, that you have to look for first. But there is some ambiguity of for example, how do you calculate the last price of the day? Do you do it as an average over the last 5 minutes or last hour? Or what's with the auction in the morning, auction in the evening, and all these things that happen or didn't happen. So there's lots of little things you can change across research teams that probably affected the results. And then again, this, what I mentioned, what I found in the beginning, the trickiest part for me was the way we had to report it. This average change per year, that sounds simple, but if you have a test on efficiency, so how do you do it? Do you do it on monthly? And then what do you do with your 0-1 decision? How do you know, so we had to wiggle around with the test statistic a little bit. We kept it off to report the changes, and probably this is where we went away from what others did, and that's probably how everyone dealt with it. So lots of different things you can do, but just like in real life.
Thank you,
Thank you very much for
Tony.
having me.
Thank you and congratulations.
Thank you.